Welcome, everyone, to this special Bible education night with the Reverend Dr. Lisa Rae Beal. Lisa, I got to know Lisa 20-some years ago at Wycliffe College when she was a student there, an Old Testament student. Lisa's background, she served for a number of years as a Pentecostal pastor before God called her into academia. And then eventually she served as a professor of Old Testament at Providence in Winnipeg. And she also jumped ships into, well, I don't know if jump ship's the right word, but she joined the Anglican Church and was ordained as an Anglican priest. So it's the Reverend Dr. Lisa Rae Beal, the new Old Testament scholar at Wycliffe College. She's agreed to come and give us a little bit of an introduction to the book of Judges. And before I hand things over to her, I'd just like us to bow our heads and pray. Let's pray. Loving and gracious God, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for this opportunity to learn more about your Holy Scriptures, and especially about this somewhat obscure book in the Bible, the book of Judges. We thank you for Lisa's calling to study Scripture and to open them for us. And we pray your blessing on her this evening as she offers her presentation and answers our questions. So bless her this evening, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Wow. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Reverend Stephanie, for your kind invitation. I hope everyone can see the PowerPoint slide. Notice it's a slinky in the picture, and that's going to be part of what we'll be talking about in a little while. Stephanie's introduced me already, and I think has hit on the main things. I love the Old Testament, and I love the people of God. And my conviction through the years has just been that we can't truly be the New Testament people of God without really a full understanding of the Old Testament. So I'm delighted to be able to be here this evening and share with you something, sort of a high overview on the book of Judges, which I've subtitled Going Downhill Fast, which doesn't sound too happy. And it's actually not particularly a happy book. So let's see where we're going to go this evening. We're not going to go downhill fast, but this is how we're going to make our way through the book. First, I want to start by acknowledging that the book of Judges has some pretty significant challenges in it. There are stories that you probably never heard in Sunday school and probably will never have preached on in your churches. There is sibling murder in this book. There is child sacrifice in this book. There's a woman who is gang raped to death and then dismembered by her husband. There is kidnapping of women to force them into marriage. So there's all kinds of things in this book, besides the fact that there's a lot of warfare in this book, that make this book really challenging for us. And sometimes we think, oh, is that really in the Bible? And is that God's holy word? What do we do with that? Well, it's not there to condone any of those things, but it is there for a purpose. And I'm going to touch on that as we move towards the end of our conversation this evening. And we'll probably have some discussion about that afterwards, I'm sure. We're going to secondly get a sense of the story. And this is actually where I'm going to begin this evening, looking at how it's shaped. Does it have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Does it have a plot in it? And what is the meaning? If we were to read this book carefully and on its own terms, what kind of meaning does the text itself communicate to us? And then we're going to ask some of the so what question. What does it mean for us here in the year 2022 as we're coming out of pandemic and we're wondering, what about the book of Judges? So let's begin with that. And I want to start with this, the shape and meaning of the story. Book of Judges, I like to think of as part 2 of a good news, bad news story. So it really goes and is paired with the book of Joshua, which immediately precedes it. In the book of Joshua, if we read it cursorily, we see that Israel goes into the land, and it seems that they go in quickly and they completely take over the land and they settle down and happily ever after. If we were to read the subtext of the book of Joshua, we would see that they do indeed go into the land. There are some places where they have great victories, but there are a lot of places in the book of Joshua where they're not really successful taking the land. It's going to be a slow process for them. And that is really what the book of Judges picks up on, sort of the slow process of Israel taking the land, and also the slowness of the process, because while in the book of Joshua, the emphasis was on how obedient Israel was to God, the book of Judges emphasizes the flip side of that, how disobedient they are to God. So it's really part 2 of a good news, bad news story. It's also a story that begins a new era. If we look at the very first verse of the book of Judges, and if you have your Bibles, I encourage you to open them to Judges chapter 1, verse 1. It says, after the death of Joshua. And it signals to us that we're entering a new era. You can think of Israel coming out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses. And then when they move into the land, they're under the leadership of Joshua. Well, after the death of Joshua, the question that's sort of hanging in the air is, who's going to lead Israel now? And what we know from the book of Judges is that for a period of perhaps 2, maybe 300 years, the leaders that come up on occasion are known as judges. Let me just explain right off the bat that judges are really not legal judges such as we have today, but they are military leaders. They are people who are raised up, men typically, who are raised up for a specific time and a specific purpose within Israel. And they fulfilled that purpose through military means and things like warfare and assassination and so on. It is also a story that is a story en route. If, again, we're thinking of moving from the time of Moses to the time of Joshua, now into the era of the judges, we're actually en route to the monarchy. And you can see here, I've got a picture of the kings of Israel and Judah, the northern and the southern kingdoms. And the actual last judge of this period of the book of Judges doesn't show up in the book of Judges itself, but appears in the first part of the book of Samuel. And it is the prophet and the judge, Samuel. And it is Samuel who is tasked with the transition of the people from an era of judges into an era of monarchy. So the book of Judges, it's part 2 of the good news, bad news. It's introducing a new era, and it is a story that is moving ahead into an era of the monarchs. If we were to conceptualize the whole book of Judges, if you don't have time to read 21 chapters, there's a lot of material in the book. You could read 9 verses in this book, and you would actually have the gist of the story. And the 9 verses are in Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 19. Let me just sketch out for you the cycle that is introduced for us in these verses. And it is a cycle that's going to repeat over and over throughout the book. Israel moves into the land. God has been very faithful to them. They say they want to serve God, but it's almost like no sooner do they turn away from saying, God, we want to serve you, than they do evil. And the evil that is particular to Israel in this era is that they serve other deities, other gods, one of whom is named Baal. He was a Canaanite deity. He was very prevalent. You could find him in all kinds of different iterations throughout the land. And they turn and they serve Baal. And if you're serving Baal, then that means by design that you are also forsaking the Lord. So that's sort of the second step in this cycle. And then following on that, the Lord gets distressed about this. The Bible talks about it as they provoked the Lord to anger. This isn't anger like you and I have, which sometimes we just sort of fly off the handle. This is God grieved in his heart because Israel, who had said to him, we want to love you and serve you alone. We want to be your people because you've told us you want to be our God. They've rejected that. And the Lord is grieved and he's angry. And one of the things that the Lord does is that he will send against them enemies. And he told them in the covenant that this would happen. And it's sort of a disciplinary measure to wake them up. Hey, wake up, come back. Know that the Lord is good and is one to be worshiped and served. So he sends enemies against them, and the people are distressed, and they get to a point that they're so distressed that they say, oh my goodness, what have we done? And they cry out to the Lord for deliverance. And it's at this point that the Lord, and sometimes even as they're crying out to the Lord, oh, help us, God, God comes on the scene and he raises up one of these military leaders, which we call a judge. And this judge is one that the Spirit of the Lord is with the judge, and the Lord himself is with the judge. And the judge, because of that, goes out in military battle, and they have success, and they get rid of the enemies for a period of time. It's often about 40 years. It says that the land has rest. So there's this real hope in the book that when the Lord raises up a judge and he delivers the people from their distress, that the people's hearts will be turned to the Lord again and everything will be great. But the problem, of course, is that doesn't happen. That as soon as the judge dies, the people turn back to what they were doing before and do so in an even more corrupt way. So if there was a hope that the judge broke the downward spiral, think again. And in fact, what happens is that the whole spiral starts all over again. The people do evil and they serve Baal. But we shouldn't think of them returning to the beginning, to what they were before. Every time they go through this cycle, they get a little worse. And this is where the slinky comes in. Because when they go through a cycle and the Lord delivers them, but they turn back and they do evil, they start almost at a little lower. It's like, you know, when you send a slinky down the stairs, I was going to embed a video here and show you the slinky going down the stairs, but I'm not technologically advanced to do that. So here's a picture of a slinky. And you've all seen the slinky go down the stairs. And you have to sort of think of this spiral like that slinky, that every time they start that spiral again, they drop down one more step into evil and wickedness. So they're going downhill fast. That's the story of the book of Judges, encapsulated for us, sadly, in these 9 verses. If we were to step back and take a look at the whole book and its story in sort of the 1,000-foot level height, the big picture, you can see that it really has 3 parts. There's an introduction, there's the body of it where we meet all the judges, and then there's an epilogue in the final 4 chapters. And I don't know if you can see that blue thing on the screen. I'm not sure how that has appeared there, so just ignore that. And if you can't see it, great. I can see it on my screen, and I'm not sure where it came from. So let's take a look. We've looked a bit at the introduction, chapters 1 through the first 6 verses of chapter 3. And that's where we have this pattern, this repetitive pattern introduced to us of Israel going down into the spiral and then being saved and then returning to worship other gods and reject God. So they go down into another spiral and down again and down again. That's what we see in the introduction. We also see at the very beginning of the book of Judges, in chapter 1, there's an emphasis on the tribe of Judah. Judah, of course, is the tribe from which King David is going to come. And I'm going to return to that. So I want to just flag that for you and sort of put that on your back burner, because we're going to pull that out again a little later. So let's turn then to the center of the book of Judges. And this is where we have all the stories that we're pretty familiar with. The story of Gideon that Stephanie will be preaching from in the future. And we know the story of Gideon. Many of us grew up with it in Sunday school. And here are the judges. Ta-da! As we go through the book, there's basically major judges and there's minor judges. And the only difference between the two is that major judges have a pretty big story attached to them, and the minor judges sometimes just have one verse that tells us about them. So these judges are the ones that the Lord raises up when they get sort of down, going down that spiral, and they're oppressed by an enemy, and the Lord raises up a judge for them, and the judge delivers them. These are the major judges that we're really talking about here. And there are several of them that we could look at, and if we had more time, we would certainly do that. But I want to just highlight a couple of them for you. All of them are pretty human characters. They have their flaws, they have some strengths. You'll notice that all of them are male. This is a patriarchal society. It was a men who went to war. And if judges are military deliverers, it kind of makes sense that they are men in that time and in that culture. The one exception is the third one down is Deborah. She actually is the only woman in the list. And she serves as kind of a legal judge. She's sort of the only one that does that. And she has a sidekick whose name is Barak, who is the military leader. And he's too afraid to go to war until she steps up and says, look, God is going to give you the victory. So go and be a man and fight the battle. But the one that I'd really like to focus in on is Gideon, because Stephanie is going to be speaking about him sometime later. Now, Gideon, we know, look at how many chapters. He's got 6, 7, 8, 3 chapters that are devoted to him. And he's the one that starts out, and he's pretty, shall we say, timid. He's beating out the grain and he's hiding it. He's trying to hide from the enemy that is coming and raiding the land and stealing all the crops and so on. And he's visited by a messenger from God, a divine messenger. And the messenger, as you know, tells him that he's going to deliver Israel. And Gideon's a little disbelieving, shall we say. And God encourages him, and Gideon trusts God and goes out and actually does some pretty major things for God. And so in some respects, we really like that about Gideon. We like to think of him as a very powerful character, along with the other judges who are powerful characters and people who deliver Israel and who often exhibit great faith. But at the end of the book of the story of Gideon, and if you have your Bibles open in the book of Judges, you might turn to Judges chapter 8. So this is as his story is winding down. And we notice that in verse 22 of chapter 8, the Israelites say to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And it's at this point that we really say hooray to Gideon, because Gideon recognizes that the only king that Israel has and the only king that Israel needs is God himself. He's the true leader. And so when the people come and say, be a king for us, like all the other nations have kings that are hereditary, Gideon says, "No, I'm not going to be a king, nor will my son be a king. The Lord is going to be the king." But what Gideon does then sort of blows it for him, because he asks of the people, probably thinking that they like him, they would be amenable to help him. He says, "Tell you what, give me silver and gold." And so he takes this precious stuff from them, he melts it down, and he forms it into an idol. It's called an ephod in the text, but it serves as an idol for him. And he begins to worship that idol. Look at verse 27. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town, and all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Isn't that interesting? This man of great faith and power, whom God used in a mighty, mighty way, towards the end of his life, he trips and he falls into idolatry. And we know that it has been idolatry that has set Israel on this downward spiral. So even this great judge, Gideon, is not without fault in this matter. And it's interesting, after this, in verse 31, he has a son by a concubine. It's kind of like a second wife, which they had in that culture. And he names the son Abimelech. In Hebrew, Abimelech means my father is king. Isn't that interesting? Here's Gideon, a man who said, "I won't be king, my son won't be king." Yet he names his son, "My father is king." That's another piece about a king that we're going to come back to. So again, put that on the back burner. You've already put the fact that Judah, the royal tribe, is the tribe that starts the book. Here's another piece. I want you to put it on the back burner. You'll also notice that in the minor judges, there's Abimelech, Gideon's son. "My father is king," Avimelech. My father is king, Abimelech. He's listed here with the minor judges, but he's actually the only one in the whole book who is not a judge. And that's why I've put him in black. And we'll find out why that is in a moment. So that sort of gives us at least a bird's eye view of this center section of the book, where we have all these exciting stories of these deliverers of Israel. And then we get to the really hard part of the book, and that is the epilogue. Chapters 17, 18 stand together, and chapter 19, 20, and 21 stand together. This section of the book is really hard going. In chapter 17 and 18, we have a man who steals from his mother, and he makes idols from the silver that he has stolen. And then we have a priest that comes along, and he seems to be willing to sell his services to the highest bidder. Not exactly what God had in mind for priestly service. Also in chapter 17, 18, we have a tribe that had been given a piece of land by God, and they reject it. They don't like it. So they go off searching for a new piece of land. They attack a peaceful people up in the north, and then they steal some idols and they make them their god. These are kinds of things, and we say, oh, that's too bad, but they might not create a great emotional response for us. But when we get into chapters 19, 20, and 21, we say we're not just seeing things, as we saw in 17, 18, that God would be displeased with, but we're seeing things that are absolutely horrific. So take a look at this. In 3 short chapters, we have strangers against the law being mistreated. We have an attempted homosexual rape. We have a woman who is raped by a gang of men, and she is raped so badly that she dies on the doorstep of the home that she was seeking refuge in. When it is discovered that she is dead, her husband takes her, throws her on the donkey, brings her home, chops her body up into pieces, and sends a piece out to all the tribes. It's just horrible. When the tribes receive these body parts, they say, what's going on? And they hear who has raped her to death, and they go against the members of that tribe, and there's intertribal warfare. So much so that the tribe of Benjamin, the perpetrators of this terrible rape, are almost exterminated. And to ensure that they are not wholly exterminated, the men of the other tribes say, well, tell you what, we won't let you marry our daughters, but you go out and you kidnap some women. And if you can kidnap them, you can make them marry you, and you can forcibly marry them. And then you can have kids and your tribe will still continue. When we read through these chapters, we should be, I think, rightly appalled. How is it that Israel, that said to God at the end of the book of Joshua, we want to serve you. We love you. We thank you for all the good things you've given to us, for the way you've been faithful to us. How did we get in one short book to this point of these horrific things happening in the epilogue? Well, the epilogue starts to give us an answer. Here's the answer that it begins to provide for us. 4 times in these few chapters, we have this phrase, in those days, Israel had no king. Look at that in 17:6, in 18:1, in 19:1, and in 21:25. In those days, Israel had no king. And twice it tells us the result of that. Everyone did as he, as she saw fit. It seems for the book of Judges that there's a recognition that a king, if a king was there, and if the king was a godly king, that people would not be doing whatever they wanted. But because there is no king, everyone is doing whatever they want. This seems right to me. I'll go out and gang rape. I'll go out and cut up a body. I'll go out and make an idol. I'll go out and sell my priestly services. All these things seem to be fair game, if you will, for a people who have no king. In light of that, let's go back and look at the Judges again. Remember I told you that Abimelech, the one whose name is my father is king, is the only one, and he's got quite a long story. Chapter 9 has got 57 verses in it. He's got quite a long story, and his story is the only story of someone who is not a judge. He is not a deliverer within Israel. The story of Abimelech is another story about kings. Abimelech, who is the son of Gideon, is one who takes kingship to himself. And he does so by killing all his brothers and saying, I will be the king over all of you, Israel. And he goes out, he does battle, he is unfair, he's unjust, He's nothing as what a judge should be. He's certainly not a righteous man by any stretch of the imagination. And the book of Judges seems to be very intent on letting us know what happens to anyone who takes kingship to themselves. Abimelech, at the end of chapter 9, has the ignoble death in that he, a warrior, is killed when a woman in a tower drops a big stone down from the top of the tower, hits the guy in the head, and kills him. That, in a patriarchal culture, was a very ignoble way to die. Remember, we said at the beginning of the book of Judges, there was an emphasis on the tribe of Judah. Remember that the king comes from the tribe of Judah. Remember at the end of the book of Judges, when there was no king, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Here, in the Abimelech story, in the middle of the book of Judges, we learn that a king who wrests kingship to himself comes to an ignoble end. A self-appointed king cannot succeed. And so it seems, in light of this, that one of the questions that the book of Judges is presenting to us to think about, to consider, is there ever going to be a king that does it right? Is there ever going to be a king that God appoints? And of course, that is what God is going to do in the next book. Well, the next book plus one, so the book of Samuel. God later is going to appoint a king of his choice. And he says of that king, if the king lives according to the covenant, lives in relationship with God, walks by the law, is righteous, and is upright, then that king will help the people live justly, righteously, according to the covenant. And if in the book of Judges, the maxim is that Israel had no king, and so everyone did what was right in their own eyes, the hope of the book of Judges seems to be that there maybe will come a king, not a self-appointed king, but one that God appoints, perhaps from the tribe of Judah, which is highlighted right at the beginning, and one who will come, who will be a righteous king, so that people will not do what is right in their own eyes, but instead will live according to covenant. So if we look at the book of Judges at that high level, that seems to be a lot of what the book is about. We have all these judges who deliver Israel, but often fail in some way, and do not ever set Israel on a long-term trajectory toward God and toward righteousness. And we see that because the epilogue tells us to the great depths that Israel plummeted in sin and unrighteousness and in ways that they damaged the community. And that brings us, I think, to the so what question of the book of Judges. And there are a lot that we could engage, but let me just talk about 3 or 4. I think one of the questions that the book of Judges raises for us is that question of violence. And we saw a constellation of violence in the epilogue. Violence against women, violence against tribes, violence against foreigners and the peaceful, just a lot of violence because people are going their own direction. And it seems that the message of the book, and I think a message for us today, is that when we do what is right in our own eyes, often the result is violence. When we don't acknowledge God and God's ways, the result is violence. And the epilogue of the book of Judges piles it on very, very thick, not to say we're condoning this, but to say, see what happens when Israel falls down into that spiral of sin, turns from God, and turns to their own ways. I think the same thing happens in our world today. In a world that so often has turned from God, we see a world of violence. And the book of Judges challenges us, I think, as a people of God, to be people who turn to God and people who stand against violence and stand for righteousness and justice and uphold the rights of the poor and the widow and the orphan. Secondly, I think in the book of Judges, we see a lot of women, and that's kind of unusual in the Old Testament. Remember that the Old Testament is written, it's in a patriarchal culture. It was written by people who were in a patriarchal culture. So the fact that they highlight and include women is really to be noticed. A couple things about women in the book of Judges. One, they often are the recipients of the violence. So the woman that is raped to death and then her body is chopped up into 12 pieces. Or the daughter who is sacrificed so that the father would be successful in battle. Women are often the recipients of violence in the book of Judges. And I think that they become part of the message to us to stand as God's people against violence that is perpetrated against women. But I think it's also important to remember that in a patriarchal culture, these stories of violence against women are included as evidence of how bad things can get. These stories of violence against women are not given to say, see how right it is to be violent against women, but rather to say these stories are included to remind us how abhorrent it is in God's eyes when violence is perpetrated against women. I think it's also important to be reminded that one of the judges in the book of Judges is Deborah. She's a woman. And that there were women who were in leadership in ancient Israel. And if God calls and equips by his Spirit and with the gifts, he seems to be quite open to having women in positions of leadership. I think that's important in our world today. This one is a really important one as well. When people went down in that spiral of sin, they were saying, we want our own way. The epilogue says there was no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. When we have human autonomy, when we think we're the center of the universe, when we think it's our way only that matters, and we don't care about God, then pretty soon we start embracing all kinds of idols and rejecting God. And in fact, the focus on human autonomy is really putting ourselves at the center, and in some respects, making ourselves the idol that rejects God. And finally, I think the book of Judges calls us to consider what genuine human freedom is. And I would say that the book of Judges, and indeed the whole of the Old and the New Testaments, does not think that genuine human freedom is self-centered human autonomy, where I am the center of the universe and whatever I want is what I'm going to get. I am the master of my world and my destiny. That, according to the book of Judges and the scriptures as a whole, has never been the route or the road to genuine human freedom. But instead, genuine human freedom is found living within the safe and good boundaries that God gives in relationship to him and in the call to live for him, to live justly and righteously in the light of his goodness and in the light of his law. So those are some of the ways that I would see the book of Judges speaking to us in our own time and in our own day. As a final note, I'd just like to mention that immediately after the book of Judges in our Christian Bibles is the little book of Ruth. I'm sure you've read the book of Ruth. It's a delightful story. It's only 4 chapters long. So if you haven't read it, before you go to bed tonight, pull it out and read it. It takes place in the time of the Judges. And in the book of Ruth, there is a man by the name of Boaz who loves God, who is obedient to God, who wants to please God and walk in relationship with God. And because of that, he actually is one in this terrible time of injustice and unrighteousness who brings joy and goodness and freedom and life to other people because of his stand before God and his stand for God and his stand for righteousness. Just a reminder that even in these eras of such horrific sin and turning from God, there are still people who love him and who serve him, and through that bless others. I'm going to stop sharing now and turn it over to Stephanie.
Thank you. Wow. So I would like everyone to, if you can, turn on your screens so that we can see everybody's faces. And I want to begin with a question to all the participants before I invite questions to our speaker, to Dr. Lisa Rae Beal. So I would like you to raise your hand if you learned at least 2 new things about the book of Judges tonight. So let's see a show of hands. I just want to take a poll. So at least 2 new things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm just going to go through. Okay, so everyone whose hands I can see, some of the screens are still off. Excellent. All right, now you can put your hands down. Another question. I'd like you to raise your hand if you've ever heard the violence in the Bible addressed theologically. Raise your hand. Okay, I see at least one person. Helen, Dave, and Helena. See a lot of hands down. Yeah. Thank you, Lisa, for talking about the violence in this book. It's really a hard book. I did not want us to talk about Gideon as a church, for me to preach on that without addressing the book of Judges, because I figured many of you might tackle the book and read it from cover to cover. And I wanted a scholar to help us understand the violence. It's probably one of the worst books in the Bible in terms of the violence that's...
Yes, it is, I would say. Yeah.
All right, so I'd like to open the floor. Thank you, first of all, Lisa, that was amazing. I'd like to open the floor now to questions. If you know how to raise your electronic hand, that's easiest for me to see you. If you don't, just raise your real hand. And if you're sitting there with your real hand and I don't invite you to speak, just start speaking. So who has a question that they'd like to put to Lisa? It could be questions or comments. Wow. No questions.
Please don't be shy.
Oh, yeah. Helen,
Please don't be
go
shy.
ahead. Helen, go ahead.
Sorry, I had to unmute. The thing that really jumped out was Abimelech, because in my Old Testament here, it actually translates it as "my father is king," but suggests that Gideon is acknowledging that the Lord is king, rather than, but it puts a completely different spin on it. So I just found that fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Helen, for pointing that out. That is a real possibility that Gideon is in this acknowledging that God is king, which he had said in verse 22, I won't be king, my son won't be king, the Lord is king. I think that's possible, certainly. But I think when he then moves to idolatry, this to me just seems to be almost like another step in the wrong direction. So thank you for pointing out that other possibility. And it certainly is one.
Any other questions for Lisa or comments? Go ahead, Owen.
There's always a reason why there are certain stories in the Bible. I have difficulty in understanding why that woman was raped so badly.
Yeah.
What was the benefit of that story?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. And it's such an atrocious story. It's so troubling. I think it's troubling for men and for women. So I'm glad as a man that you're addressing this story. I think, especially in this book, in the places where it is so raw, it is one of the ways of that it's trying to say, look how bad it can get when people turn from God. They worship idols, they sell priestly services, and it gets even worse. And then it goes on and it tells that story. And I think it's part of it is a shock value, because I actually think that we, even as God's people, sometimes, and maybe I'm speaking for myself, I don't know, but I think sometimes we think, well, I'm pretty good. I would never do those kinds of things. And it sort of like gives us a sucker punch saying, well, think again, because here is the people of God in the Old Testament who've been busted out of Egypt and sustained through the wilderness and brought into the land. And within just a few short generations, look how bad they got. So it kind of is a sucker punch, I think, trying to warn us a bit, lest we get complacent ourselves. And maybe the horror of it attests to the fact that we can get pretty inured to our own ability to be sinful. I think the shock value is really intentional. I think it knows that it's a horrible story, that God is not at all pleased with this. He does not in any way condone it. And he wants us to be shocked too.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Bill. Oh, you have to unmute yourself, Bill.
Sorry about that. Appalling as the actual rape was, I found the worst part was the master.
Yeah.
So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them.
Yes.
I thought that was worse than the actual rape itself.
Yes. Yeah. So for those that don't know the full story, the Levite, so it's a religious person and his concubine, the one that ends up getting raped. And they are traveling from the south back home up north, and they stop at a village to spend the night. And someone takes them in saying, don't spend the night out in the square, as if maybe it's dangerous. And a gang of men come to the door and they want the visitor, the male visitor, to be sent out to them with the idea that they're going to rape him. So homosexual rape. And instead, he pushes his concubine out. And it's, again, for me, here's the caller. it's the depths that religious people can go to, and we're all religious people. And so that's even appalling too. And then when she comes and she's raped through the night, and in the morning she puts her hand on the doorstep, and the text never says she's dead. So we could assume she's dead, but he comes out and he says to her, "Get up, let's get going." So is she not dead? And he puts her on the donkey, brings her home and chops her up. So did he murder her, or was she already dead? So either way, he doesn't really come off well. And then when the tribes get the body pieces and they say, "What's going on?" And he, the Levite, who sent the body pieces around, he sort of tells the story in a way that he actually looks pretty good. So he's just a despicable character.
I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we're coming to the conclusion that the story wants us to come to that conclusion. I think God is up there saying, "You read well, you guys. He's not a good character. I don't condone this."
Other questions? Go ahead, Dave. Go
Let's see.
Dave Hamilton and then Owen.
In relation to a partial answer to Owen's, or even on Bill there, that as a student of history, I look at this is like they always say history repeats itself, and our Holocaust by the Nazis was another. If you talk to the Nazis at the time, they thought they were fine. They thought that these were subhuman people, whether they were Russians or Jews or whatever. They don't consider themselves doing bad at the time. And then you've got people like Stalin, who murders his own people, but blames the other side, the Germans or something, just to get them going. That's the same thing as what you just read there in Judges.
Yeah.
You send it out to the tribes, get them all rallied up and get them on your side and get them to kill people. History is rife with this kind of stuff because people are basically returning to their sub-brain practically. You become animalistic. It's really easy to incite a mob, which is being done all the time around the world.
Yeah, and we see
it's that
even
the last part that you, Lisa, you said there that it's a human, almost a redemption at the end of coming out of Judges. We only become human when we turn to God.
Yeah.
When we don't, we're almost subhuman.
Yeah, the reality of sin and how it makes us something that we were never intended to be. And that's why, so if you read the book of Judges, and especially that horrific ending, and then you read the book of Ruth, which takes place in the same era, and you see it's almost an idyllic story in comparison. And it is one in which people love God and care for one another. And Boaz is a redeemer because he, I think, goes above and beyond what God's law requires of him. And it is a reminder to us that the book of Judges is not what we're to be like. That was not God's intention for us, for God's people, or for New Testament people today. Thank you, Dave. That's such a good perspective, the historical one. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in, and Owen, I think you had a question, then Kahindi.
It's not a question, it's an observation. When I look at this story, it reminds me of the book of when I lost my thought. When Abraham,
Thinking about Lot.
nephew, Abraham's nephew. What was his name again?
Lot.
Lot, yes.
You see that? When he was in Sodom and Gomorrah, the street wanted him to send the men out So this story reminds me of that similar situation where these guys are sodomites in this story also, where they want to have sex with the man and Warren was with him.
Mhm.
Why would this story repeat itself here? Or
Why would it appear? I'm sorry.
why would it repeat itself, the story here in Judges?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I think a couple things. Similar kinds of sin happen, as we've just heard from Dave. Similar kinds of sins happen throughout history. I think this was, in the ancient world, was seen as something that was particularly problematic. And so it's not surprising that it shows up as illustrative of the fall of humankind. So, and I think also in both cases, not only is there the attempted homosexual rape, but there is also the inhospitality, whatever the word is, that sets the whole thing up. And that was, Israel was supposed to care for the stranger in their midst, and that doesn't happen in either of these stories. Kahindi, you had a question.
Thank you. Oh, Kahindi, you have to unmute yourself.
Just a comment to that. The lesson I'm taking away today is that we have to be very, very careful as Christians. The fact that something is commonplace in our society does not mean that God condones it. Mm. And we can think because it is popular and we join others to do it, we may also get into the collectively get into the era of the judges. Mm. And in the era of the judges were there, but God was silent. And God allowed them to do all these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So. And that's a really good observation, Kahindi. And when Israel went into the land, Baal worship, and Baal is one of the deities that they repeatedly worship in the book of Judges and further through the text as well. But it was pretty prevalent in the land. You know, your neighbor worshiped Baal and your person down the street worshiped Baal. And it was just prevalent. And you begin to realize why, when God told them to go into the land, he wanted them to get rid of Baal worship, because he knew it was seductive, it was subtly attractive, and it was prevalent. And I mean, they loved God, they wanted to serve God as they went into the land, but they got sidetracked. And we see it all the way through the book of Kings. I'm working in the book of Jeremiah these days. It's also there. And I think whatever the idols are for us in our world today, I don't know that many of us have neighbors who are worshiping Baal, but we have idols of money and prestige and power and consumerism. Mm. All of those things can be idols to us. That's why we need to be reading our Bibles, praying, encouraging one another, going to church. All those kinds of things are the kinds of things that help us stay alert and attuned, and we can be holding one another kindly to account. You have a priest over your flock, and she is tasked with your spiritual well-being. So, you know, sometimes she might be preaching hard at you. And I think that's one of the things that we need to be reminded of.
No pressure.
Preach it, sister.
Are there other questions? We have time for one more question. I'm just looking for raised hands. So don't hold back. Lisa, that was amazing. It is 8:29.
You hoped we'd be done in an hour.
I was astonished. We talked about roughly 40 minutes and then 20 minutes. And I looked at my phone when you finished speaking and said it was like 8:10 exactly.
Wow.
I'll give a round of applause to Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, so much.